The reason it's so important to focus on the United States is simply because the United States has played a unique role in the international system. International system is not self-organizing. If anything, it's been American-led. And when the United States either does things that I believe are ill-advised, or history will show to have been ill-advised, or the United States doesn't do things, and the active omission will be seen to be ill-advised, there's no one or thing there to take its place. It's not a self-organizing system, and there's nobody else who's willing and able to play this role. So the alternative to an American-led order is not a somebody else-led order. It's a nobody else-led disorder. And that's what we are increasingly seeing in big chunks of the world. I think what's also added to it has been the American campaign and the transition and the first, 6 weeks of the administration. And we can talk about it at whatever level of detail you want, but I think what was said repeatedly and policies that have been adopted have shaken people up. That essentially I should have a nickel for every time somebody mentioned it to me. This is not the United States I thought I knew. And that things that people thought they could assume, they could no longer assume. Things that people thought were givens are not necessarily any longer givens. And what I believe this has meant in particular for friends and allies of the United States is it's shaken them up because they have made the strategic decision to place a lot of their security in the American basket. And they feel less certain that the United States will be there for them in any and all circumstances. So it's, and I think what we've done in some cases has been the foreign policy equivalent of the Obamacare debate, the Affordable Care Act debate, which is a little bit of repeal, but not much in the way of replace. The new administration has raised questions about traditional American policies, but hasn't made it clear what would go into their in their stead. And I think that has been something of the patterns of raising questions about alliances, or in many cases raising questions about traditional policies. Now, even when it's gone back to the original policy, the mere fact that the questions could have been raised have thrown people for a loop. Because again, it reinforces the sense that what we thought we could take for granted, we can no longer take for granted. And, and this president has a bias in foreign policy, which again have contributed to it. And I think there's a disruption bias. The default option is one of change. The president's view of foreign policy in many cases is that the United States has spent a lot more in foreign policy than it's derived in the way of benefit. Or I guess to use investments, we're in New York, that our return on investment hasn't justified what we've done. And he's seen, even last night again, he talked about the great costs of American foreign policy, the trillions of dollars spent. What's interesting, the examples he's using, by the way, are not costs that were associated with American alliance commitments. They were the costs that were associated with ambitious wars of overreach. But I just put that in as an aside. But also he doesn't talk a lot about the benefits of foreign policy. Both the things that happen, the stability that's been derived, or the things that haven't happened, for example, the kinds of conflicts and proliferation that might happen if the United States were not there. So I think it's a fairly one-sided accounting. If you add up everything we've spent on foreign policy, it's big numbers, but not in terms of share of GDP. Even with the president's proposed increase on defense spending, $600 billion, which is a lot of money by any measure, but it's only about, what, 3.2, 3.3% of GDP, which is far less than the Cold War average of what we spent on defense. And we did just fine economically throughout the Cold War, so in no way with that level of defense. We can increase it by $150 billion. And we still wouldn't reach Cold War levels of percentage of GDP devoted to defense. So it's you know, we can have both guns and butter. Indeed, we need to have both guns and butter. And to the extent we've spent poorly on foreign policy, or a lot on foreign policy, it hasn't precluded us from doing things we need to do at home. Or you can't put it another way, you can say the Iraq War was a colossal mistake, and we spent trillions of dollars we shouldn't have spent. Okay, but you can't blame the Iraq War for the 2008 financial crisis. None of the generals forced us to deregulate derivatives. I mean, so this blaming of foreign policy for what ails us domestically, or you can't blame what we did in Afghanistan for the fact that LaGuardia Airport, I spent hours on the runway last night. It just doesn't work that way. So I worry a little bit about where the thinking is on that, and but again, I think it's reinforced the sense of uncertainty.